Hi, this is Andy Yen from Proton, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 346 for October 16th, 2023, and we've got a fantastic interview with Andy Yen. He is the CEO of Proton. He is back on the show. I believe this is his third time on the show, which puts him in the company of Bruce Schneier and Troy Hunt and Phil Zimmerman in the three-time club. We've got just a few guests, actually, that have been here more often than that. I was curious. I went back and actually did some math on this and looked at some of these. Daniel Davis and Chris Romeo, we haven't had on the show, either of those guys, in a long time. They've been here longer. Cory Doctorow actually has been on the show 5 times, or will have been on the show 5 times, coming up soon, along with Ernesto Falcone and John Graham Cumming from EFF and Cloudflare, respectively. So anyway, Andy's been on the show several times, and we talked today about kind of your personal threat model and how to figure out, of all the privacy and security products out there, which ones make sense for you? Because we're all different. Everyone has different things that they're trying to protect and different sets of consequences should that fail. And so there is no one size fits all. There is no silver bullet. There's no one product or even suite of products that will solve everyone's problems. And on top of all that, you've got to figure out, of all these companies and of all these products, which ones you can actually trust, which is not honestly an easy thing to figure out, which is a shame. So today, I will ask Andy some questions around that and much, much more. Real quick, I just want to note that the California Delete Act was signed into law. That is a big deal. I will try to talk more about that some next week, but we talked with Tom Kemp about that a little while ago, and it's finally made it through. And I think we will probably all feel some benefit from that. All right, so real quick, before we get to the interview, there are a couple mild curse words in here. I usually try to give you a heads up if that's the case, because I don't really explicitly flag this show as a podcast for adults. But I also honestly don't care if my guests curse a little bit, and I don't feel like trying to bleep it out or whatever. So anyway, just heads up, fair warning, just a couple mild curse words. All right, with that in mind, let's get to our interview with Andy Yen. Andy is the founder and CEO of Proton. He was a scientist at CERN, has a PhD in physics from Harvard University, and has long worked to advance privacy and freedom online. Welcome back to the show, Andy.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's always great to be back.
So, and again, I want to say thank you publicly for doing the blurb for the book. That was really a big deal, and I very much appreciate you doing that.
Well, I actually meant what I said in the blurb. I do think it's one of the best resources out there. So, I'm glad people are picking up the book and beginning to learn from it. So, yeah. Wish you all the success on this book.
Thank you so much. All right. So Proton's gone from a secure email service to a company that now offers a pretty comprehensive suite of products, including VPN, calendar, cloud storage, password manager now, and even more. So let's do a little history here. How did you get from there to here? And what drove you to add these specific new features and products? Because in the last few years, you've added on a lot of new cool stuff.
Yeah, well, I think what drives us hasn't really changed since 2014 when we started. We were a crowdfunded community through an Indiegogo campaign, if you remember back in those days. It was, donation at the beginning, right? And it was really community driven. And the things that we add, it's really in response to community demand. So, calendar, we didn't wake up one day and get a brilliant insight that we need a calendar, right? It was hundreds of thousands of people knocking on our front door saying, build a calendar and do that.
I was one of them. Yep.
Yeah. So of the whole list of products, I would say there's maybe only 2 that stand out a bit. One's a VPN. When that came out, it really came out of left field. People were like, where did this come from? And that was maybe an example of us trying to anticipate what we think the market would need, as opposed to what people were asking for. And the need that we had forecasted at that time was, it was only a matter of time before some governments in certain countries decided to block and ban Proton. And at that point, those people would probably need a free VPN. The problem was all the VPNs out there were sketchy as hell. They were mining your data, leaking your information, logging your information. You couldn't trust any of them. So there was literally no free option on the market at that point, which is why we came in. And, I like to say we can kind of see the future, and maybe we did in this case. But, fast forward to 2022, You have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You have the war.
Yeah.
You have the censorship happening. And all of a sudden you have, millions of Russians that want to get access to free information, want to access their Proton mail. And these are mostly people who are opposed to the regime. And then Proton VPN, became a lifeline in that case. So that was, I think, a very, clear case.
Yeah.
Password manager, it was also, community demand, but we couldn't do it for many years because there was just too much going on. And then you'll probably recall last year, we merged the company together with Simple Login. We kind of got together, and all of a sudden we had a team that was, an expert in authentication, logging in, things of that nature. And that gave us the capabilities to bring that to market. And I think it was quite interesting because the thing about Password Manager, what does it protect? It protects your passwords. But let's say you're following the rules correctly and you have a unique password for every single site that you're using. And that site is presumably doing its work properly and has, hashed that password. Well, in a data breach, the hash copy of your unique password gets leaked. Are you really that distraught over that? Not really, right? It's not such a big issue. But what else is leaked actually is your email address. And, you can't take that back. It's a pain in the ass to change. I know because I get people to switch from Gmail to Google, from Google and Gmail to Proton, and they tell me it's really hard, right? So, it's hard to change email addresses. Once you put it out there, you're at security risk for phishing and other attacks. So in fact, what I saw was password managers, they were sort of protecting of the two pieces of information that they are supposed to protect, your login and your password. They were protecting and focusing on the one that was actually the less important one, the password, which is easy to change. So I thought, people tell me, well, pass is a crowded market, and it is, right? But I do think we were able to come with something that was unique, different, novel, and honestly also better. And that's why we did it. And also met a community request as well. So, it seems a bit random, but it is largely what the community wants us to do because we're accountable to the users. And, if you ask for it, you're probably going to see it eventually.
Well, all right. Fantastic. So when people ask me about what products to use, and I get that a lot, my response is almost always, that depends. And, then I try to explain the notion of a threat model, so, what are your risks? What are your consequences? What are you trying to protect? That sort of thing. So I want to talk a little bit about threat modeling today. So when people inevitably ask you these kind of questions, how do you explain this concept with someone who may not have a cybersecurity background? What do you tell them? What kind of questions they should be asking themselves to kind of flesh this out? And maybe do you have any suggested resources that might help people kind of figure out their threat model if they're not comfortable trying to do this on their own?
Yeah, what I realized a couple of years ago is that no one really actually understands what is threat model. We in the industry use the word very frequently, but people, they really have no clue. And so in terms of resources, about a year and a half ago, we did a series online of, blog posts, and we called it Privacy Decrypted. And it was really trying to decrypt and make more simple some of these complicated concepts that are critically important in privacy and security. And there were a series of maybe, 7 or 8 blog posts, all titled Privacy Decrypted with a topic afterwards. So if you go to proton.me/blog, search up Privacy Decrypted, you'll find it. And the first post in this series was actually on threat model, because I think that's actually the foundation upon which all privacy needs to be built, right?
Right.
And for the uninitiated, the threat model is simply asking yourself the question, what am I trying to protect against, right? Because depending on your objectives and who you are, what you need to do personally and professionally and also from the tools that you use can be radically different. And the key point about threat model that people miss that is really important to keep in mind, though, is there is no such thing as the best threat model, the perfect threat model, or the one threat model. It's not one size fits all. In fact, everybody has a different threat model. And today, we often see, security solutions trying to be the, get this and you're safe, right? But it's not true because it depends on who you're protecting against. Yes. So I think that the notion of understanding your personal threat model and also just acknowledging that everybody's threat model is different. Once you've done that, that's already a massive first step, I would say.
Sure. All right. So given the fact that there's this broad spectrum of security and privacy needs out there, and honestly, people's varying degrees of tolerance for change, as you're thinking about these products and how you design your products, how do you decide how you balance security versus convenience? And then, how do you decide what threat models that you guys want to address and which ones that you don't?
Well, it's very, tricky one. I always tell people if we wanted to, optimize for security and privacy, then we could all use, one-time pads and then we're done, right? And that's perfect. But I'm also reminded of something that, I realized many years ago, and, I think someone made a point to me, which is that, the most secure product in the world doesn't actually bring any value to the world if no one can actually use it.
Right.
So this is, of course, the balance that, we all have to strike somehow. And I have to say at Proton, trying to find this balance is one of the most challenging things that, we have to do. Why? Because our spectrum of users, let's say, ranges from the dissident or the activist in a totalitarian regime that is trying to stay safe in fear of death, all the way to the other person that, is signing up for OnlyFans and doesn't want that in their Gmail, right?
Right.
This is a spectrum. So how do we cover the spectrum? And the honest answer is it's actually impossible, right? What I have to do is sort of pick a happy medium within this range, which is honestly, a product choice that, we ourselves make. So as a company, how do you confront this issue? And what I believe is the only way to solve this problem, there's two ways, right? Number one is transparency. So if you're transparent about what you do and do not protect against, and, define your threat model with an article that tells about threat models and you publicize that, then that I think honestly goes a long way because it lets people understand, does this product work for my threat model or not? So transparency is the first one. And then the second way to do it is by incorporating different product features that cater to different threat models, but making those features optional. So I give you one example, and maybe people miss this. Years ago, we introduced something in Proton Mail called, address verification. And actually, I'll put the question to you. Do you even know what address verification? Have you heard of it before?
I mean, we're talking like DKIM and that kind of stuff, or something more simple.
Yeah. You see, so and in that regard, I think I've succeeded because if you knew about it and everybody knew about it, then I would have done it wrong because I don't want everybody to, use this feature because it's not for everybody's threat model, right? But here's a common problem in encrypted email. Today, when you're messaging someone else on Proton, actually you're encrypting with your public key, right? This is how technically it works. But the question needs to be asked, how can you trust the public key that you have been served, over the internet, right?
Right.
And actually that's a big problem because if Proton was being malicious, I could actually serve you a fraudulent, a fake, public key and execute in a sudden fashion a man-in-the-middle attack. And this is not unique to Proton, right? This is unique to every single end-to-end encrypted service out there. But the odds that you would have a threat model where this is a real threat to you is highly unlikely. Yet there are some people within our user base for which they cannot take any chance. Even the chance of getting a fraudulent public key is too high of a risk for them, right? So address verification is actually a form of key pinning. What it does is it pins the signature of the public keys of your known contacts in your contacts. And if you're composing email and then, the key is not the one that you expect, it pops up a warning to tell you. And, this sounds crazy. You would never need this feature. It sounds, way out of the deep end, right? But because Proton is trying to use features to cater to a wider range of threat models, we have this feature. No one knows about it. But if you're a person that's paranoid enough or, sensitive enough where this matters to you, it's there. And this is, I think, one of the ways in which, we try to strike this balance, right? By having optional features, not for everybody, to reflect the fact that not every threat model is the same.
Gotcha. Is there just kind of a tool within Proton or maybe it's part of that series of articles that actually kind of walks you through some of these things and helps you decide, hey, maybe you didn't know about this feature, but if this is something that's important to you, maybe this is a feature you might want to enable.
Yeah. Well, if you go dig in security settings, which, most people don't go, but, if you want to go dig there, you'll find a lot of these little, secret, gems in there, right? And I'll give you another example, which is, what I consider, IP logging. Let's talk about IP logging for a moment, right? If your threat model is, I want to stay anonymous, I don't want the government to track me, IP logging is terrible because it can break your ability to be anonymous, right?
Right.
But let's say you're very security focused and you're a public figure. Well, you're not trying to hide your identity because everybody knows who you are. You're a public figure, right? And in this case, actually, IP logs could be very valuable for you because it allows you to see where the logins are coming from. And if you see a login in your account coming from, say, Russia or something, then that might put up a red flag for you and allow you to detect the breach in your account faster, right? So you cannot universally say that for privacy, IP logs is bad.
Right.
IP logs could be bad depending on your threat model. And this is why, again, at Proton, IP logs off by default. But if you want, you can turn them on. This is just another example of this. And this is why the discussion of threat modeling is, so important, because we often have preconceived notions of what is private, what is not private, what is secure, what is not secure. But oftentimes, the, let's say, default answer may not even be the correct one for you, right? And it's very, very context dependent.
Right, and that's a great example, and it's an excellent point that these things are often conflicting. I mean, the different settings that make sense for different audiences for different threat models, and some of them are mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a great point. So when we're talking about security and privacy companies, there's a lot of companies out there, as I'm sure you're well aware, that are selling ineffective or inadequate or even borderline fraudulent security and privacy products. So, and as regular consumers that don't have a technical background, how can we as consumers figure out what we can trust and which products actually do what they claim to do? Are there any objective litmus tests that you could recommend? Are there any red flags that we should cause us to steer clear of certain products? How do we do this evaluation?
Well, I think there's a couple ways. The first way is probably to check if something is open source, because no matter what the claim is, unless you have access to the source code and it has been independently verified by other people that can see the source code, it's very hard to trust any of these claims. So I think, open source is the closest thing that we have to a litmus test. Then, even if, everything is open source, actually, I would say that's not sufficient to remove trust, because trust is always part of the equation. Mm-hmm. Because even open source software, at the end of the day, is written by people. And people, have their biases. People can make mistakes. People can be compromised. So what I would say, in addition to open source, is sort of, transparency, in terms of people. And let me maybe give the example of Proton, right? At Proton, I'm a public figure. People know who is behind the company. Our other, key people, we're all public, right? Mm-hmm. So what I'm doing is actually I am staking my personal reputation and my, scientific, integrity behind the fact that my products, say and actually, do what they say, right? And if you were to compare it to, let's say, some random VPN company where it's a shadowy person that sits in the background, you don't even know who they are and where they're based and what they do, that person is not personally putting anything on the line and doesn't have, let's say, the same incentives from a personal and professional standpoint to do things in the right way, because I have placed my whole reputation on the line, and I think that's a very important element in trust as well, because the transparency, what it gives isn't just transparency for transparency's sake, right? What transparency gives is actually something much more important, which is accountability. And accountability is what I think the industry needs. And it can only be achieved really by being transparent.
Well, that's an interesting point, because, and this is something I often bring up when people talk about these things with me, is I say, well, follow the money, see who's behind it, what the funding is, what the business model is, and what the reputation of the company is behind it. But in this industry, as you well know, there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and so sometimes when LastPass was bought out by LogMeIn, that was a troubling moment for me, because I didn't know where they were going to go with it. There was a VPN I used a long time ago that got bought out as well by somebody else, and I'm like, so now what happens? What happens to all the data? What happens to the products? And I've seen it go both ways. I've seen cases where it was the company that bought them out gave them the funding they needed, gave them the resources they needed. They created better products. They had better backing, better support. And other cases where it was some hedge fund or some, like this is really true in the VPN industry. Right? There's a lot of consolidation in the VPN industry where it turns out it's just people trying to turn a buck, and they cut corners for security and privacy. So tell me a little bit about how you defend against that, or how do you even know in some cases that this has even happened?
Yeah. Well, a lot of times it happens and you don't know, right? This is the issue. And this is why I think it comes down to people again, because you have to understand, what is the intrinsic motivation of, a company? What is a company's mission, right? And if I look across, let's say, most of the VPN industry, I would say the mission is to make as much money as possible, without regards to whether it's scrupulous or not, right? It's just, collect money. Mm-hmm. And you see this because, you have these companies that are spending probably the vast majority of their margin and their revenue just on advertising, right? And you wonder, okay, well, how much money then is actually going in a product? So People is not a guarantee of this, but I think understanding who runs these businesses is important. I'll give you an example, right? If you have a company that is run by, and not to knock, business students, right? But, someone that used to work at a hedge fund and, got an MBA from somewhere, who do you think that's going, right? That company is probably going to get sold and flipped for a profit in a couple of years, right? If a company is taken, let's take the example of, one passer, right? The company has taken, 1 billion roughly in, VC funding. Well, that tells you who controls that business and where that's going to go in the future. And, we're not saying that Proton is the perfect counterexample, but, the fact that we today don't have VC investors, the fact that it's, run by scientists. I can tell you, there's no money in science, right? You don't go to science to make a buck. There are no bucks to be made in science, right? It's not, let's say, definitive, but it does, I think, provide more confidence. And the most important thing, though, also is kind of alignment. Because if you look at Proton's brand, the reason people trust us is actually because we're different. Because we are scientists, because we are for open source, and because we are here for the mission, because we do believe in what we're, doing rather than, making the fastest buck, right? And that also kind of in a counterintuitive way also creates a financial incentive to stay the course. And I'll kind of explain what I mean by this, right? If I were to suddenly, change my stripes, tomorrow and, go full on, influencer marketing on YouTube, sponsoring every single channel, and also taking out, massive amounts of, VC money and being a completely different company. Actually, I would say a lot of Proton users will look at that and be turned off by that. And they would probably leave, right? So because of the brand that we've built, because of the way that we have done things for the past 10 years, actually, there's a financial incentive that even if I were to get struck by lightning and become evil tomorrow, it wouldn't be in Proton's financial best, interest to actually change the current course because people have come here because of the culture that we have built. So, so this is why in the long run, this actually provides a safeguard as well, because, who you attract is who your customer base is, and you're ultimately accountable to your customers, right? The people that pick, let's say, an ExpressVPN or NordVPN, they probably don't give a shit about privacy, right? They just want to watch Netflix. But the ones that pick Proton VPN out of the other ones, they care about who I am and my mission. And that, in its own way, also forces me to stay on the current course I'm on.
Yeah. So there's, in this community, there's so many reviews and people are trying to do the right thing. We're trying to pick the best products and features and for our audiences. And I've seen so many different review sites that tend to go for like the most dire threat model. Like if you are not perfect, absolutely perfect, and however they define perfect, you can't be trusted. Maybe you're part of a Five Eyes country, or you're located in a Five Eyes country, or you have been just bought out by somebody else. Maybe you're not 100% open source. Maybe you don't have audits, and they try to nitpick everything. Yeah. I'm sure you must get this all the time. If you could talk to these people that review these products, how would you recommend that they give a more balanced, more fair perspective on these things, and the transparency and the nod to, well, maybe this isn't your threat model? It seems to me like a lot of people want to talk in absolutes, and there just aren't absolutes. So if you could talk to these people who are reviewing your products, or products like your products, how would you recommend that the most sincere, useful way is to review security and privacy products?
There's two elements to this. First is just understanding, right? If you don't understand the technology underlying the products, then it's hard for you to be able to come up with an objective yardstick on measuring products. Not to pick on VPN, but I'll kind of give you an example, right? There was a craze a couple years ago, which is still going on today, and still seeing the reviews about, diskless servers, right? And I asked this question, okay, if you're not logging, if you don't send information, on the server, and if your server, is fully encrypted, why does it matter if it's diskless or not? So this is something that is completely security theater. That's a term for this, right? And it stems from the fact that, these people doing the reviews sometimes don't have the technical knowledge to really begin to assess whether something is actually important for security or it's purely security theater. I see the argument about, countries and location coming up. And some people say that it's bogus, but actually, I do think it matters. And I'll give you an example, right? Proton Drive, for example, take that as an example. Everything is end-to-end encrypted. I could, in theory, store all my data in Russia, and it would actually be safe, right? In theory. But in practice, that's not the case, because in practice, if you have infrastructure in Russia, you've just given the Russian government leverage, right? So you can claim, for example, that you're based in Panama, but if all your employees are in the U.S. And you're operating out of the U.S., then the U.S. government has leverage. They don't care where your post box is actually located. They're going to come get you because and they're going to get you where you're located, right? So I think things like that, like the location that you're based in, that's something that does actually matter. So it's really education. Now, the second part of this is also the question of, who's writing the reviews and how are they incentivized? And in the VPN industry in particular, I would say the top review sites, at least the majority of them, are actually owned by VPN companies, right?
Right.
So, you might go to a site like, I guess one that everybody knows about is, VPN Mentor, right? VPN Mentor is owned by Cape, which owns Express, Private Internet Access, CyberGhost, etc. So you go on there and you look at the top VPNs and, guess which ones are the top four, right? Surprise, surprise, right? So I think that's the other aspect of the game. And it's very difficult because you as a consumer, you have no way of knowing about that relationship. It's not openly and publicly disclosed to you in an easy to find way, right? So the average consumer really has no clue. And I think that's the problem with the review industry is that, it's sort of gotten in bed with the products themselves. And a lot of times you really can't trust reviews because you don't understand what the financial incentives are that are driving these reviews.
All right. So you talked about the country of origin, and maybe that's even the wrong word. So there's a lot of country things involved. And you just brought up one that I didn't even really consider is it's not just a matter where the financial headquarters is. It's not just a matter where the data server actually resides. It's actually where the employees are, right?
Yes.
Because you could pressure the employees too. And I mean, often the weakest link in any system is humans. So
yes.
For the average Joe, is this really something that we need to look at? Do we need to look at where all our data is hosted for my emails and things like that? Or is this really just for the higher level threat models for politicians and activists and things like that?
Well, I think for the average person, you're more worried about, the privacy company that you trusted, than turning around, getting sold, and then selling your data, right? And violating your privacy. So that's the actual, probably what worries you. But if you're a more sensitive use case, a lot of people say, VPN companies in the US is fine, right? But, the US has FISA courts. There's things like national security letters, right? You could get served with a national security letter that forces you to log and also not disclose it, in which case you would start to log and not disclose it if you're based in the US because you're subject to US law. So in fact, that is a real concern. And this is why I think transparency of location is important. When I look at the VPN, I would say what makes Proton kind of unique is, we're one of the only VPNs that has an address on our website, right? And, you could go to the address that's on the website, knock on the door, and, I'm actually sitting at the address that's on our website, right? And this is like unheard of in the industry, right? And I think, you need that transparency because where people are based, it is important. And, I'm sitting here in Geneva, Switzerland because I know the Swiss government cannot come tomorrow and force me to log. There is no legal way in which they can do that, under Swiss law. But that's not the case in the US. So I do think it does matter. And the bigger problem is a lot of times these people, might say one country, but they're not actually there. I'm not going to give the examples for this, but there's practically no VPN company other than Proton that is actually at the country that they say they're at, right? So that actually poses a big risk for you because you don't know what they actually are. So as a result, you actually don't know what risk you're exposed to because they haven't disclosed to you what risks you might, face based off of their location, which, you don't actually know, right?
As an engineer, are there engineering technical solutions to this? Like, you mentioned the diskless thing, which in turn doesn't really matter if you've got it encrypted, but can you set your business up so that you can't log? I don't know if that's possible. Are there technical solutions to these other than political solutions or geographical solutions to making sure that you engender trust with your audience and say, look, we can't be forced to do this because it's not technically possible? Well,
as an engineer, I would say everything is technically possible, right? It's impossible to say, this is completely ruled out. And you do need to trust people at the end. So what it becomes is a question of leverage. How do you design your company in a way that you don't give any potentially, dangerous party too much leverage over you and your business? And that is like an organizational design question that really has to come from the beginning. You have to actually build it in a certain way to avoid those risks. Even Proton, for example, we don't put all of our eggs in the Swiss basket, because that actually would give too much leverage to one country. And, we know that, well, the laws of math are pretty constant, right? But the laws of a country, all it takes is one election for that to change. So it's a conscious choice that must be taken at the very beginning on how you organize your business. And if you don't factor that in at the very start when you're building the organization, it actually becomes too late. You can't change it after a certain period of time. And it's a tricky topic, right? People don't like to talk about it. But if you want to do things properly, it's something that you do have to factor into account.
All right. So I don't know how much you could talk about this, but I'm curious, how much, has Proton received in terms of pushback, either directly or indirectly, from law enforcement or government agencies for offering your services? I must imagine that privacy, like Signal and some of these other companies that are very privacy focused, there's a lot of legislation being passed right now to try to force open, or put back doors and encryption, things like that. So I'm just curious, what can you tell us, if anything, about how you have resisted or been approached by government saying, hey, you got to stop doing this, or you got to give us privileged access, or can you just tweak this thing right here?
Yeah, it's changed over time. And I think what is important that in thinking about this is a long-term trend. So when we started in 2014, actually, within a couple of days of starting, PayPal shut us down because it said encryption is illegal, right? It's not true, but that's what they believe, right? But that just goes to show the perception. When we started, 9 years ago, a lot of people thought what we were doing was actually illegal. And that kind of shows you where government and where society was, in terms of their thinking, right? Then, of course, Snowden came out around the same time. Yeah. We had Cambridge Analytica, we had all these things going on, right? And then there are all these, massive attacks and hacks by state actors. We had, Russia trying to influence U.S. election through hacking. We had Hillary's emails getting hacked, right? All these different things. So what I can say is, these same governments that in 2014 were very strongly criticizing us, well, today, some of them are now customers of our products, right? So basically they realized that actually we need encryption to stay safe. So I would say the long-term trend is good. It's positive. But that doesn't mean that there's, progress. It's like you take 2 steps forward and then 1 step back, right? It's a bit like that sometimes. So currently there is sort of a push, in US, in UK, but also in Europe to try to do more, to crack down on encryption. So the whole talk of the encryption backdoor has come up again, right? And I expect this fall there to be more debates about this. In my kind of, opinion, I feel like, the cat's out of the bag when it comes to encryption, right? But legislator will always push back on this. So today, of course, we need to have people, both in Brussels, but also in DC, sort of educating lawmakers about, why encryption is important and how you can't build a backdoor that only lets the, good people in, right? So that, I think, part of the business has changed. Our focus in the early days was purely tech. It was only technology, it was only a product. But today, I actually need to spend a significant amount of time on education and lobbying. So, Proton, I wouldn't call them lobbyists, right? But we have, public policy people in Brussels and in Washington, DC, which is essential because if we're not there passing on the message, then I don't know who is. But that becomes absolutely essential because, the arena, let's say, in which we fight for privacy has also changed.
That's a great point, actually. I've got to wonder, do you have like an outreach program to politicians? Because for the ones that have had their emails actually hacked, or people that certainly being in Congress, you probably know somebody who's had their accounts hacked. Have you reached out to these people, say, I'll give you a free Proton Ultimate account, to help them understand the value of this personally? Would that maybe change some hearts and minds?
Yeah. So our teams in DC and in Brussels, they actually spend almost all their time meeting politicians. I've also been myself, personally to Capitol Hill in the U.S. twice to kind of educate and, inform. And I've done the same thing also twice in Brussels. So it's absolutely essential. And I think, Proton is fortunate to be a bigger company now where we have the resources to do this. But I would encourage, other players in the privacy industry, as long as they get to bigger scale, this is an investment that you have to make. There is no ROI from it. There's no money I'm going to, make from doing this. In fact, it's a cost center that costs us quite a bit of money every single year. But if we want privacy to survive, in the next 100 years, we need to start laying the groundwork, and, setting the stage now and doing the education now.
Well, and you said you're thinking what, over 500 employees at this point at Proton?
Now we're over 400.
Over 400. So any company of a decent size has to sometimes or must have to worry about infiltration by bad actors. When you're a small company, you know everybody, and I would think it's a little more simple. But now when when you're hiring a lot of people, I would think that can be a security risk. So what sort of security precautions can be implemented to protect against insider threats? For example, Tesla. I mean, they just 2 employees of Tesla just gave up like all their employees, personal details. I would have to think that's a significant threat.
Yeah, I think it's extremely difficult to do properly, to be completely honest with you. There's a couple ways to approach it. One is if you set up your security procedures and internal processes in a way that someone who would think to do something like this is almost for sure going to get caught, that can be a very strong deterrence, right? Because if you do get caught, there are very strong personal implications for yourself. And that's something that we do put into place. Secondly, it's just rigorous background checks. So understand who they're from, where their family is based. Do they have a grandma in Moscow, for example, right? That could get dragged into the basement of the FSB headquarters and compelled to force them to do something, right? So understanding points of leverage, points of weakness. Do rigorous background checks. This you always have to do. And the third thing is really just by, limiting control as much as you can, right? So, applying the principle of least access. So only give someone access to something if they absolutely, need to have access. And then the fourth thing, which is what, Proton really practices, is a malicious actor cannot steal from you or leak from you something that you yourself don't have. So if I encrypt things properly and have as little data as possible, that's actually the most effective way of, minimizing the attack surface here. And that's indeed what we try to do, right? We try to encrypt as much as we practically can. We try to retain as little information as we can on our customers. And it's also a security tool because it makes Proton as a company a less appealing target if there just isn't a lot that you can get if you were to get in.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the LastPass breach because that was the DevOps guy who was working from home and he got his Plex server hacked. I mean,
yeah. But anyway. But what the problem with the LastPass breach was? The LastPass breach was the fact that they didn't encrypt the website and the domains.
That
right?
was horrible.
They didn't use bcrypt. They used some other weak hashing algorithm, right? So it wasn't that they got hacked. Everybody's going to get hacked sooner or later, right? It's bound to happen. It is inevitable. It was that their security practices were so poor that they made it really easy to take that data and potentially breach it in the future. And so if you're a LastPass user, your encrypted data store is sitting somewhere on the internet, and it's just a matter of time before someone's able to crack it because they didn't use the right technologies.
So here's a question for you, and this is a tough one, and this is what the people have asked me. Do you stop trusting a company like LastPass? Or do you hope that they're going to fix it and move and get better as a result of this? How many strikes do you give a company like
Yeah. So in kind of like a perverse way, I almost sort of prefer a company that's had an incident because if you never had an incident, maybe you're just never aware and never woke up, right?
Right.
Right. So I think the fact that they had an incident does mean that they take it more seriously now. And that might be better than someone that never got hacked, right? But you also need to look at the nature of the hack, right? And, security, where it comes from, ultimately is culture. It's people. It's the way they think, the way they act, the way they behave, what they consider to be acceptable. And if you look at the LastPass situation, what was considered to be acceptable was actually an extremely low bar. And I'm sure they're awake now, but to realign the bar for your entire organization, top to bottom, that's an extremely difficult thing to do and very, very hard to do on a short time frame, right? So I would be still a bit wary, let's say, right? Because I know from personal experience how hard it is to change culture within an organization. But yeah, I think it's wrong to kind of say, if you got hacked, then you're bad because everybody's going to get hacked sooner or later. It is kind of inevitable, but it's really a question of, where was your bar at, right? And, what the hack can often teach us is sort of the level of, rigor that a company had in the work that they, were doing. And that can be very telling.
Well, I think another example is Zoom, because back in the day when when COVID hit, Zoom went from a nobody to a household name, and they were claiming all this end-to-end encryption, which turned out they didn't have. But then their response to that, I thought, was good. I mean, they hired a lot of top-notch people, some people that anybody in the security industry would know their names, to come in and fix things. And I think they actually have made a lot of progress. So. Yeah, I think sometimes maybe it takes an incident like that to get you to shape up.
Yeah. I think it's kind of a wake up call, right?
Yeah.
And it's so I can give kind of, and this is all the same for legal processes, right? There are some people out there in the space competing against Proton who what they say is, Proton had this had legal issues and legal court cases where governments came after Proton user data, et cetera, right? And we're better because it's never happened to us. And my reaction to that is, that's not the case, right? Because it never happened, no one actually knows what will happen when they come for you, right? You don't even know yourself, right? But Proton, because there's been thousands of cases, there's now a strong legal track record and precedent of how this is handled, right? Conclusively what Proton has or doesn't have, because it's gone through 7,000 cases, right? So it's kind of the same, I think, with, security as well. The notion of being battle tested is actually a real notion. And I think, organizations are frequently under attack. It does make them tougher. I'm not saying that we have the best DDoS protection in the world, but the fact that we've been hit so regularly, so consistently over the past 6 years has made us do some things different that probably other companies that don't get hit, wouldn't do.
All right. So speaking of threat models and especially higher threat models, you guys just rolled out a program, which I did not see coming. I don't know if this is something you even telegraphed that was coming, but it's called Sentinel, Program Sentinel. And it was designed, well, actually, let me ask you, who was it designed for and what sorts of protections does it provide?
Well, it really comes down to threat model. And I think, logins is a very good example, right? Today, it doesn't matter who you are and who your enemy, is. Everybody more or less gets put through the same login authentication process, right? And our view on this is, if you're the Proton user that has a Proton account to, access OnlyFans because you want to keep it hidden from your wife, right? Your threat model is probably not as severe as a dissident that is using Proton, because if their communication gets leaked, they're going to get executed, right? Given this range, it makes no sense to treat security as the same, and we should differentiate. Now, what is the problem? If I were to apply the same rules to everybody across my entire user base and the same, type of rigorous analysis in blocking fraudulent logins, number one, that doesn't scale, and number two, that could also be hugely inconvenient. So, what is Sentinel and what does it do? Well, Sentinel is essentially an enhanced security program that is better at detecting when a suspicious action is taken on a protected account. And what it will do in this case is apply more stringent and secure ways to police the logins. So to give you an example, let's say you're a politician that has Sentinel enabled, right? And you have flown to a different country. Well, when you try to log in at your destination, because your account is protected by Sentinel, you may actually be forced to, SMS verify, right, before you're able to get into your account. And it makes sense because this person is under greater threat. But for the average user, that could be super annoying. They could be really pissed at me if I did that to them every single time, right? But the politician, would be able to accept that because they understand that they need to have higher level of security. And this is one example of, how we do things a bit differently. Now, of course, Google also has advanced protection. Facebook has their own program. This type of program is not new. I think what makes Proton's Sentinel program different is it's not just about setting more strict defaults, right? These programs from Google, what they do is they force the defaults to be very high. So they force you to use a hardware authentication key, for example, right? And we don't do that. In fact, even though we highly recommend 2FA, we don't even force it, because, some people don't want it, right? Some people, refuse to use it. I can't force upon them something they don't want. So what Sentinel does is it's not about putting insanely high defaults. even though we do strongly recommend it and strongly encourage people to do that. What it's about is combining human with machine analysis. So all tech companies are using AI and machine learning to try to find, suspicious activity and try to block that. But even the best AIs in the world today are still not as good as the best humans. And, arguably, they will never be as good as the best humans because there's still some human element that, is superior. So with Proton Sentinel, there's a team of analysts that work 24/7, across 3 different time zones, which are monitoring suspicious, events taking place on accounts that are protected in the program. And so, it maybe gets flagged by algorithm, but a human is reviewing it. And this actually gives you a much higher level of accuracy than is possible if you were to use only machines or only humans, because the algorithms allow them to work at scale. It allows them to scan maybe, 10,000 accounts at once, right? Mm-hmm. So it flags the accounts that have issues, and then the human can do a much better analysis than AI could. So I think it's that human element that, makes it different. But that's also why it doesn't really scale. We cannot scale it to everybody because, I would have to hire 1,000 people or more to do that, right? Which is practically impossible. But it's also okay that not everybody has it because not everybody is going to be facing the same level of threats.
So, well, you lead right on my next question, which is you do have this now made available to anybody with a paying account, as far as I can tell. So are you worried that a lot of people are like, oh, yeah, I'll sign up for that. And now you're going to be slammed with, a lot of people who really don't need this signing up nonetheless. Will you be able to scale with that?
Well, it's not to every paid account. It's to all unlimited accounts. So that does, limit the universe a bit. But actually, I do think it can scale because if you don't really need this and you activate it, first of all, it's a good thing to activate because it doesn't hurt, right? But your account is probably not likely to get targeted. So it's not going to generate that many security events for analysts to analyze, right? Whereas some of the accounts, so I can't say who, right? But some of the politician accounts that, we protect, we're seeing events like every single day. And that's of course a very high load. And I'm telling you, some of these politicians maybe are only paying us, 10 euros a month, right? And we're spending way more time than that, to help them. But it's a bit like insurance, right? There's some people that cost insurance companies a lot of money. Other people who are very healthy and never pay a dime from the insurance company, right? So it's a similar concept, but, applied at scale. So it can actually scale in the same way that insurance can scale. It doesn't work if everybody files a claim, but not everybody's going to get sick. And just like for us, not everybody's going to get hacked.
Interesting. All right. Well, I signed up for it myself just because I wanted to see what it was like so I could kind of report on and get a feel for what it's going to do. I haven't had it long enough to know if I'm going to get a lot of emails about, hey, this looks suspicious, or I get challenged more. We'll see how that goes. But I did get a welcome email with it that had, among other things in it, it suggested that I send you guys to a particular email address at Proton details about my threat model to, quote, help us more effectively protect your account, unquote. I'm just curious, how does that information affect the service? What changes might you make based on what I might email you about me?
Well, part of Proton's challenge is that because we are a privacy company, we really don't know who our customers are, right? I honestly don't know, and I can't say most of the time. And it's different from Google because Google probably has your full name and has your airplane tickets. It knows exactly who you are, right?
Yes.
But honestly, I don't know. And that can be sometimes a hindrance because let's take, for example, you're a journalist reporting on Russia, right? And you have already previously been targeted by Russian state organizations and state hackers. Knowing that information is hugely valuable to me in protecting your account because I know these are the signals of, advanced persistent threats from Russia. I know these are things that they do, right? I can apply that pattern recognition now to your account to see if I see some of those same behaviors. But I wouldn't want to apply this to, everybody because it wouldn't make a lot of sense, right? So what this request, it's optional, of course, of letting people identify themselves to me is simply making sure that in protecting sensitive users, I have the same information that, a Google or a Facebook or someone else would have, right? If you have a Facebook account and you're a politician, and it says, for example, Donald J. Trump, they know who that is, right? But, we don't have that information. So it's optional, but it does let us customize, based off of the threats that we expect you to face and the threats that we have seen. So, if you say I'm a journalist working on Russia issues, well, because I have hundreds of other journalists as well, who we have seen attacked in the past. I know what to expect. I know what protections to apply, and I can apply sort of, the playbook that we use to protect them to you. And that is probably better than the default.
So if I'm a politician or a dissident or somebody, actually probably more like a dissident or a journalist, and I'm considering this, should I worry that I'm giving you this information that I assume must now be associated with my account that could then be queried? Is that something that, for instance, law enforcement could say, hey, give me everything that this person self-reported about their account?
Yeah, and this is why it's optional, because it depends on your threat model, right? So if your threat model is Russian law enforcement, well, Russian law enforcement cannot get information out of Switzerland. It doesn't happen, right? Switzerland doesn't cooperate with countries like that. And that's why we're banned in Russia, by the way, right? So if your threat model is, Putin's, spies coming after you, then actually you're not running a risk by giving us this information, right? Now, Swiss police could access it, but if you're a journalist in Russia, are you actually concerned about the Swiss police? Maybe not, right? So this is why that's why it's optional, and it goes to our philosophy of kind of customizing, right? If you're using Google, you don't have an option. Google's default is to mine all your data and build a profile on you, right? But with Proton, you can decide what you disclose, what you don't disclose, and we will do the best that we can with the information that we have.
So without naming names, I know this program just went public, but it's been around for a while. I don't know if you'd call it beta testing or what. I know that, or maybe you just kind of VIP treatment handed this off to certain people that you thought might want it. But so it's just been in existence before you announced it. So have there been any, without naming names, have there been incidents that you've been able to block because of Sentinel? Have you learned from these incidents? I'm just curious what kind of experience you've already had with this program. Yeah,
so you're correct in that Sentinel isn't exactly a new thing. Right. We were always offering enhanced protection to certain accounts that came to our attention that belonged to prominent personalities that were being targeted because, quite frankly, we saw the attacks in our monitoring. So it's not brand new in the sense that the technologies that it leverages have always been there and have been protecting Proton accounts for many years. And actually, these same technologies, in fact, are also being used even if you don't have Sentinel, right? So if you're like an average user, I would say the default protection level at Proton is already much higher than other, competing email services. And to kind of give some context, per quarter, the amount of account takeover attempts that, we block, because these same systems, also work for non-Sentinel users, but, in a different way, in numbers in the hundreds of thousands.
Wow.
So that kind of gives you sort of the sense of scale. And it also shows how big that problem actually is. Mm-hmm. And among Sentinel users, yes, there are, there have been a couple of situations, and it's mostly, attribution is very difficult, right? Mm-hmm. But we've already had, a number of incidents, almost on a quarterly basis where we are almost certain it's a Russian state actor that is, going after these accounts. Some of these have, let's say, leaked in the public domain. So the one I can share with you is, the investigative journalist at Bellingcat. This is an organization that, reports on Russia. And I can tell you this because they themselves publicly talked about this, right? Yep. They were targeted by, very sophisticated, state-sponsored actor, several years ago, right? So these things, it may seem a little bit hypothetical and abstract, but indeed they are happening. And, so the program does have, a reason to exist. It's not security theater. There definitely are incidents and events where we see this happening out in the wild today.
All right. So last question before you go. As I said earlier on, you guys have come a long way since 2014. As you know, it was Proton Mail, and now you had to drop the mail because you do so many other things. So what's missing? What's left to complete your vision of Proton? Are there any offerings that you're not that you're ruling out? Like people have asked you for years, you're like, nah, we're not going to go down that route. So what's the future look like for Proton?
We have come a long way, but it's all relative to the target. And I'll kind of give an example of this. We recently celebrated 100 million accounts. People said, wow, that's a huge milestone. Wow, privacy has really gone mainstream. I didn't imagine Proton could get so big, right? And my answer to them was, well, do you know how many accounts Google has? Google in the same time period has grown to 3 or 4 billion accounts, right? So comparatively speaking, we're not doing so well. We managed to get Mail, Calendar, Drive, VPN, and now Pass. And yeah, from kind of where we started 9 years ago, that's good progress. But compared to Google's ecosystem, this is nothing, right? So to some extent, I'm worried because although we've made progress, I also feel like the gap between us and say the Googles of the world, it has actually increased. I'm maybe further away. So I've grown my product portfolio by 500%, right? But I may even be further away from where Google was, compared, 9 years ago, right? Relatively speaking, right? So that's a point that, worries me quite a bit. So my concern is really on velocity. How can, privacy and what we're doing go faster? Because we need to start to close the gap instead of letting it widen. And to be honest, without some good regulations to enforce fair competition, both in the US and the EU, it's going to be very difficult to close this gap because we're essentially fighting with, one hand tied behind our back, maybe even two hands tied behind our back. So part of this, I think, needs to be regulatory pressure and regulatory changes, which give us a more fair, playing field. But that doesn't mean that we're sitting still and waiting for the government to come save us, right? We're still going to push and try to do our best to close the gap and build the ecosystem. And what are we adding next? Well, the best way to find out is just to see what comes up often on Reddit, right? It's what the community is asking us to do. And I would say, photos, for sure that's coming because, photo support is the biggest thing that people have asked for since Drive launched. If you look at Pass, desktop and web apps, for sure they're coming. Personally, I find the browser extensions and mobile applications fully suited for my needs, right? But, there's a very vocal contingent that wants desktop applications. So, that's coming as well. If I look also at, what we've done on Drive, a lot of people are asking for documents. They want to have better document previews, document editing, collaborative documents, for end-to-end encryption. That's also coming. Better sharing functionalities to allow, file sharing, password sharing, Proton Pass Vault sharing. This is coming as well. And we made the first move in this direction, with the family plan that we launched, right? Family plan was sort of the first sort of, non-professional ecosystem where you could share among a group of people. And this concept will get extended across the rest of our products. So this is probably what is coming in the immediate, 6 to 12 months future roadmap. But, we want to do a lot more. There's so much that Google does today that, no one in the privacy space is covering, that I think is absolutely essential that we need to do. Because in the end, we want to be an alternative. And to be an alternative, you unfortunately need a full ecosystem. And that's just the reality of, of working online and competing against big tech.
All right, Andy. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about threat models and all the things you guys are doing. And I would love to have a Google Docs replacement. There really aren't that many good ones out there, so I'd love to have that. So put my vote in for that one for your next big feature. Thanks for coming back, Andy.
Yeah, of course. Well, as I said, if you're asking for it, given the way that Proton works, it's going to come. So, I encourage everybody, come on Reddit, come on Twitter, engage with us. Let us know what you want. Because at the end of the day, we're here to serve you. We're not here to serve advertisers. We're not here to serve investors, right? You're the end customer, and Proton, our mission, it belongs to you. So, again, it was a pleasure to be here. Always happy to, speak and, hope to be back in the future with some new features and new products.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andy. It was great to have Andy back on the show. I really, really enjoyed talking with him. He and I actually often talk offline a little bit before and after the show, and I really enjoyed the chance to speak with him and get his opinion on some things. He's a very, very interesting gentleman. And I got some bonus content, as always, for the patrons. You guys will be getting that on Thursday, as usual. I kind of asked him, Andy, why he does what he does. What drives him to privacy and what are kind of his philosophies behind it. We also get into a little bit of a debate about how serious Apple is about privacy. We all know I'm an Apple fanboy. But, even I know Apple's not perfect. And so anyway, we talk a little bit about that. And we also talk a little bit even about, why Andy felt the need to pull Proton out of Russia. So anyway, that'll all be in the bonus content for the patrons. So as I said in the interview, I did turn on Proton Sentinel myself a couple months ago, and I really honestly haven't noticed any change in the service. I'm not getting a lot of annoying warnings or strange restrictions or anything like that, which probably just goes to show that I'm not a really high value target. There's not a lot of people trying to get me. But anyway, it's if you're our premium subscriber, it's a free thing, and I don't know why you wouldn't turn it on. I put a link in the show notes to the Privacy Decrypted blog issue number 1. If you go there and you do some other searches, you'll find the rest of them. Just search on Privacy Decrypted. I also put a couple links to some interesting websites that you might want to check out for determining your kind of personal threat model, and maybe help find some tools that would help you. Consumer Reports has a great tool called Security Planner, and Ars Technica has a really good series of articles on threat modeling as well. I put links to those in the show notes. So we got some great shows coming up. Next week, I'm going to have a bit of a light news show plus a mailbag feature. I'm finally going to answer several, not just one, but several Dear Carry questions in one episode. And then we've got some great interviews coming down the pike. We've got Cory Doctorow will be the next one up. He'll be talking about the encrapification of the internet, though he doesn't use the word crap. And I also recently spoke with Danny Rogers and Rocky Cole, who are the co-founders of iVerify. That was a really interesting discussion about mobile malware. And several other great interviews are already in the works, so subscribe now, and that way you won't miss any of it. That'll do it for this week, everybody. Take care out there, stay safe, and until next time, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.